the catastrophe let's just put it this way: the more than normal rainfall and the extended period of monsoon, as well as the direction the monsoon has taken, that's climate change. Catastrophe is something that I would lay at the door of the humans, because we have not prepared ourselves. The climate change, climate change is not something that's just popped its head. We've been talking about it for decades. Pakistan has been in the top 10 bracket of the vulnerability index since before 2010 floods, but in 2010, of course, we crept up that vulnerability index. Rather, we jumped up, not even crept up. But now, 12 years down the road, what did we do which can be termed as, saving people from the manifestations of climate change? So when we look at it as a catastrophe, we look at it from the angle of human misery, from the infrastructure losses, from the livestock losses, about the croplands devastated. But then we also, when we look at it, these are all in places which are actually the pathway of the rivers and rainwater. There are some perennial rivers, there are some non-perennial, like in Balochistan. Most of the Balochistan, as well as the southern Punjab, what they call Rodkoi, the hill torrents. Similarly, in Balochistan, it was a hill torrent. So the flood of 2010, those comparisons are actually would throw us off, because that was a river flood. And that hasn't just yet started yet. We have just about filled one dam, and then the river water will start coming down. The fear is that whatever we are facing will be exacerbated, that if we haven't strengthened the embankments of the rivers and the canals, and if the breaches occur. Right now, we are experiencing breaches from the rainwater torrents that are coming down. But if there are breaches alongside the river, and this water is also going into the river that is coming from the hill torrents, that is going to be a bigger calamity. So I hope that there is, because the river floods give you a warning. If they start right up in the north, the southern part of the country gets many days of warning to move people away, move the settlement, evacuate people, their livestock, strengthen the embankments. And when we didn't do that, that is why the 2010 floods became a calamity as well. But right now, it's climate not responding to the dangers of climate change, not recognizing that the actions that we need to take are very, very imperative. I think that is where we would lay the blame for the calamity.
I want to add here as well that, as Afia has already mentioned, and this is something that Ali Taqir actually wrote in his Dawn editorial, that the monsoon pattern is changing, and that is climate change. There's no denying that. Jawad Memon Sahab, for example, he was noticing, and he's been pointing out for a while, that the South Asian monsoon, particularly the coastal areas of Pakistan, there is increasing moisture content. And that is basically, that certainly means that more rain in Karachi that we've seen, that also means more rain in Las Bela and coastal areas of Balochistan. So this is something that did not happen as frequently in the past. This is also something, if we look at averages of Balochistan, the average for monsoon for Balochistan is so low compared to what has happened, basically because Balochistan did not receive as much rain in these months. And to top it off, when we keep on talking about the catastrophe, Pakistan is a vulnerable country. It is in top 10. Sometimes it's number 5, sometimes it's number 8. The reason it's in top 10 is not because of the frequency of rains or the amount of rainfall. Tropical countries, for example, India, for example, receives a lot more rain. So our vulnerability is much higher, mostly because of under-preparedness, mostly because of poor state capacity, mostly because of poor investments. And this is very multi-sectoral. You can look into food security. We don't have enough investment into it. Our crop yields are low. So when floods come, crop yields will obviously fall and you won't be able to cultivate for a certain period of time. So that exacerbates our ranking in vulnerabilities. If we were number 9 or number 8 the past year, it is likely we're going to go shoot up a couple of ranks next year. So it's not just certain impacts from climate systems. It is a lot of it is governance and poor state capacity and large failure of the state to improve its response. So, in some cases, when I talk to relief workers right now who are much more experienced and who have been in the field in the 2010 floods or even in the past, they tell me that the state response is something that usually tends to come as a reaction. And the NGOs and private sector are currently waiting on more donations. They received a lot more help during the 2010 or 2011 floods. So this is, I think, something that is in our response frameworks. We start depending a lot on NGOs and CBOs. Our state actually starts depending on it. It has outsourced a lot of this work to district administration, and district administrations generally don't have the capacity. They haven't built the capacity, and then they wait for these organizations to come up. So the response isn't there. Response is dependent on a lot of external factors, donations, organizations, volunteer workers, and poor preparation is exacerbating a lot of this.
So the district administration, you're saying it doesn't have the capacity. The capacity is supposed to have been with DDMAs, with the local bodies, and they're not there. So that pyramid is actually hanging in midair. And this is why you see this kind of a reactive approach. And as far as the NGOs and CBOs, who were very effective in 2010, they have been decimated by this security, mindset in which their registrations were cancelled, and many of the donors, that link between the NGOs and the donors is broken. This is why right now you are seeing that slower response, because many of the donors have left Pakistan. They found other people to work with, because Pakistan, they have to have all kinds of intelligence agencies, despite seeing the work on ground, digging back into your shajara and still not giving you permission. And many NGOs are mid-sized and small-sized, and they've been absolutely squeezed out of the development sector, because you can't just function without any kind of stream of work. And that is why they've had to let go of people. So they don't have that capacity now. They don't have that human resource, and they don't have the donor link. So there have been so many things that have shown this response to be very sluggish. And this is not how people in Pakistan have been. They have been very quick responders. The NGOs, the CBOs, even the corporate sector. So now each and every one of them are looking at each other. How do we collaborate? How do we get there? How do we get the permissions? So the selfishness of the state to have completely shattered that entire setup that would have been able to kick in immediately. And now the NOC has been issued to the NGOs to help in the relief operation. How do they help? They don't have the resources anymore. So it means that the bigger NGOs will be getting that bigger areas. And right now, because this is the situation we are in, it's essential that NGOs also create networks among themselves. It has to be collaborative. You cannot be territorial. And I'm afraid that, if we don't start collaborating and creating networks, that one NGO may be providing food, the other may be providing relief, the third may be providing shelter, we will not be able to, meet the demand, which is huge. It's much larger than we saw in 2010. And I think the rehabilitation stage will come much, much later than it did in 2010 again. There's no running away from climate change. If the monsoon pattern has changed and the monsoon is going to be more severe and more ferocious and more frequent, there's nothing we can do to stop that. That's a larger global agenda, which somehow we are missing all the targets and we are crossing so many tipping points. So that debate actually cannot really be carried forward by us, except at global forums. as far as we are concerned, we simply have to, up the game as far as adaptation is concerned. We have to build the coping mechanism of our communities who are in harm's way, unless we move them out of there. But moving them out where? That has to be mapped. That had the vulnerability, the hotspots, the climate hotspots have to be mapped, and the safe spaces have to be mapped. And people have to know that they cannot go back to the vulnerable spots. Because you see, you try to rehabilitate people, but if they're going back, you actually end up spending a lot more in these reactive measures of relief and rescue, rather than investing into providing them alternate places which will, give them a better kind of a life, less vulnerable life. So Pakistan hasn't even started scratching the surface as far as this is concerned. But having said that, we do have models on a small scale which need to be replicated elsewhere. The GLOF areas, the Gilgit-Baltistan, the GLOF project with the Met Department, with UNDP, they have put in place where you will see infrastructure losses, because again, I mean, if it's the GLOF, the lake burst and the water is absolutely rushing down with great force, so it will wipe away whatever is in its way. But thankfully, there have been very few fatalities. In Chitral, there have been, in Gilgit-Baltistan, there have been very minimal losses. Because the communities have been sensitized, they've been told about the threat, they've been moved away, they have the early warning system, they know how to respond to the early warning system. They also have safe havens where they know they can get get out of the way of harm. The safe havens have stockpiles of supplies which will see them through the difficult period. That is the kind of response we need to have in for people who are living in vulnerable areas. And if we look at what has happened in Swat, this is 2010 2.0. Exactly the things that were seen in Swat, where people had these construction, the hotels, etc., in the middle of the river, is what we have seen this year. So 12 years down the road, we are still at the same spot. So where was the governance structure? Why were people not sensitized? So it's a whole 360 intervention, from advocacy to planning to policy to legislation to implementation. All those things have to be done, not one after the other, but together. It's only then that a vulnerable country like Pakistan will be able to sort of reduce the vulnerability and build its coping mechanism.
When you look at the Disaster Management Act, it actually mentions that the chairperson of the DDMA, which is the District Management Authority for Disasters, is supposed to be the chairman of the local union council. And further atop, when you go, it's supposed to be wherever there is a mayor, the mayor is supposed to be run it. Wherever there is a elected chairman of a particular metropolitan corporation, they're supposed to run it. We only had elections in KP recently after a huge gap of, I think, about 6 years. We don't have local bodies in Punjab for the past 4 years. We don't have local bodies in Sindh for the past 2 years. And when these existed, they still didn't have the DDMAs. They still didn't have the allocations for disaster management. We, in Balochistan, of course, it's whenever you talk about policy, we tend to avoid discussing Balochistan because the administrative issues have been exacerbated by this whole securitization of the province, which also means that democratic representatives have not been given authority over key budget heads or key decision making. So this whole issue, I don't think CBOs or NGOs can come resolve these. UNDP and PMD can, of course, provide technical assistance and design the program. In GB, you don't have local governments, but at least you have community level participation and organization, which is sort of linked to the local traditions. Especially when you look at Hunza and Nagar, the systems that they have based on the community adjudication, and they have the alternative community-based organizations. They use those methods, and it has been so far a successful model, not just for disaster management. It works for maternal and child health care, it works for education, it works for sports. That's why you have a female football team that is very active in these northern areas. So you can only have those sort of community interactions and sensitization and participation when you let these local bodies remain in place for a certain period of time. 5 years, 10 years should be enough. People start participating, people interact with their representatives. They ask that you had an allocation of 110 million this year. Where have you spent? Did it go on health? Did it go on disaster management? We had a heat wave. Did you set up any sort of water coolers or anything? Did you set up tents for us? Did you set up fans for us? So these questions then come up because people have to get re-elected. So in that sense, we really have to start forcing, and we have to start looking at local government from a environmental management angle. That's how it happens. And this discussion has been ongoing since Karachi rains of 2019. This is why the local government election is of such a big interest in Karachi compared to any other region, because people have started to understand. Activists continuously talk about it, and they realize that right now we can hold accountable, such as the EPA. But this was a discussion last night as well, that when you talk about the EPAs in general have a certain targeted approach, that these things that they have to regulate, and they don't go beyond that, the very written formal word of their duty. The rules of business say this, they will do this. But at the very local level, you will have street level participation. You will have people who go beyond their duty, and maybe for example, I myself have not seen this happen in my lifetime, but I see examples of mohalla committees, I see examples of civil defense when floods used to come in the 70s and 80s, that community level participation usually came out. We didn't have NDMA, we didn't have PDMA at that time, people still responded. So we need to possibly reduce this centralization. We have an obsession with centralization everywhere. Right now, a lot of questioning from the NDMA as well. What does the NDMA do? NDMA says that we've given it to PDMA. And of course, provinces haven't given it further to the DDMA. So this is where your sensitization will start. And sensitization, again, will take 5 to 10 years. So we have to start right now, immediately.